Thanks so much, Roger. What a treat to be with you today in Oxford. So I'm Becky Ingamells, I work for Tear Fund, and I'm just going to spend this time talking to you about Tear Fund's theology around poverty and social community transformation, transformation, because our theology of poverty and transformation informs our approach and how we deal with poverty. So just a little bit about me. As I said, I'm Becky Ingamells. I live in Hastings. I grew up there and I live there now, which is an area of deprivation on the south coast of England. And I've worked out the other day, it was a bit too many years now, I've spent over 25 years either working in church or for Christian organisations, often looking at community transformation, often in areas of that are very deprived. More latterly, I've spent 9 years working in international development and working at Tear Fund. So again, really looking about how we bring community transformation and how that works internationally. At Tear Fund, I'm the head of church partnerships. So I have the great privilege of speaking to church leaders as part of my job. I travel around the UK. I often speak to leaders of church networks across the UK or some of the bigger churches. And one of the things I often find is that I'm talking to church leaders about their theology of engaging with social action, because most churches are engaging somehow in their communities. And I spend a lot of time really thinking about what is their theology around that, because good theology informs good practice, and it also gives us a real measure of whether we're succeeding in what we do. I'm sure most people in this room have got an understanding of Tear Fund, but just really briefly, Tear Fund's been in existence since the 1960s, late 1960s. Amazingly, what happened was there was a famine in Nigeria, and images started flocking onto our TV screens of famine and malnutrition. And I think it was one of the first times we'd really been exposed to this so much, like in our own homes, seeing these images. And all across the UK, churches and Christians started pouring money simultaneously into the Evangelical Alliance. And so Tear Fund was the Evangelical Alliance Relief Fund, and it really came into existence because of the heart and the generosity of the UK church wanting to engage in transformation globally. Tear Fund believes that the best place to bring transform communities is the local church. So we work through the local church. We work with about 32,000 churches in some of the poorest countries in the world. So we work with over 50 different nations we work with in. And I have the great privilege as part of my work of going to visit some of those countries and some of those churches. And I'm going to share a little bit of our learning with you today. I'm really aware in a room like this, there is a lot of expertise in the room. There's a lot of people that practice social transformation or have studied it, and there's a lot of expertise here. But I'm just going to bring a little flavour of how Tear Fund as an organisation also engage with this. And so to start with, our theology really frames how we approach community transformation. And I'm going to say some things just as a reminder, really, to many of us. But we really believe that the transformation of communities and societies is important to God, and it starts with God. And when I look at the Bible, what I see is that when people encounter the presence of the living God, it is often followed by social transformation. I'm just going to give a really whistle-stop tour of some of those stories from the Bible. So you know the famous story of Moses when he encountered, didn't he, the presence of God at Mount Sinai. But what happened after he encountered the presence of God was God gave him instructions of how to look after the whole community that he was with. And so we know from Deuteronomy, God gave advice. He gave suggestions, things like tithing. God suggested that if people gave 10% of the grains of what they had, that could be given to the most vulnerable. There was ideas of gleaning, that the first people took the first fruits, but they left behind for the vulnerable in communities so they could also take some of the fruits and what was the grain in the land. And we see the idea of Jubilee. I think that's already been mentioned today, the idea of debts going free after a number of years. And in Deuteronomy 15, there's this verse that basically God is saying that if you do these practices, it says there should be no poor among you. And that what goes through the whole story of the whole Bible, of this idea of an amazing, awesome, holy God that wants to bring change to communities, that wants to bring transformation. We see that through the Old Testament prophets, that again and again they're coming back to God's people, and God's speaking through the prophets saying, remember the poor, remember the vulnerable, remember the marginalized. Don't forget to look after the widows, the orphans, the vulnerable. And I love that famous passage in Isaiah 58. And God says that basically people are coming, they're seeking him, they're eager to know his ways, they want to come near God. And yet God challenges them through Isaiah, doesn't he? And he talks about true fasting, true worship to God is feeding the hungry, giving them something to eat, is not exploiting our workers. And so there's this constant reminder of when we encounter the presence of the living God, there's a reminder that that must be coupled with representing God and looking after the marginalized. We see Jesus, don't we, coming in and going straight away to those outside the temple, those people that are sick or demon-possessed or being cast aside, the vulnerable. Straight away he goes and he brings his presence to those people. And then we see the church in Acts when the day of Pentecost comes, when the Holy Spirit is poured out on God's people. The very first thing they do is go into their community, start responding to poverty, to start bringing in the transformation of God and his kingdom. And again, we see this echo in Acts of the verses we see in Deuteronomy. It says in Acts 4, there was no needy persons among them. That's a real echo of what God's heart was in Deuteronomy, what his USP, if you like, is that when God's people are encountering the living God, that God flows through them and brings that transformation, that there shouldn't even be needy people in our communities and societies because we carry something of the presence of the living God. For those that have know some of your history or like Tom Holland as a historian, again, he's really emphasized that the early Christian church transformed even thinking about what was okay and not okay in societies, in transforming them. And he believes that the church was significant in even changing people's mindset of what we should live with in terms of poverty and society. And so we start off with a really basic framework that we have, that God wants his people to engage in community transformation. And engaging with the presence of God should be leading to something coming out of us in the transformation of society. So we know that we have a theological mandate. We read the Bible, we encounter God. We know that he wants us to engage, and we do engage, don't we? In all different ways we engage in the blessing of our communities and societies. But the question I just want to unpick a little bit this morning is, how do we engage? I've worked with a lot of church leaders all across the UK, and I find again and again there's loads of well-meaning, amazing practices because we know we should do something. But at a certain point, sometimes we come unstuck because we haven't really underpinned it with a theological framework, or we don't really know what success looks like. And Tear Fund has got a lot of its thinking over the years from a book, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. If not, I'd really encourage you to look at it. There's a book called When Helping Hurts, How to Alleviate Poverty Without Hurting the Poor and Yourselves, by a guy called Brian Fickett, who was looking at international development and began to study it for himself and came up with some best practice ideas. And he says this in his book. He says, the way we define poverty plays a major role in determining the solutions we use in our attempts to alleviate poverty. So before we jump in and do something, it's really good that important that we have a good definition and a good theology. And he talks about how in the 90s that the World Bank did a study where they spoke to 60,000 people in some of the lowest income countries in the world. And he asked them, what is poverty? They asked in the study, what is poverty? And the responses came in, and there were things like this. Poverty is shame. Poverty is depression. It's powerlessness. It's inferiority. It's feeling I have no voice. And what people began to discover was in economically successful countries, we define poverty very materially and economically. But in lower income countries, it was much more defined in psychological terms. In fact, even if you look on the government website, there's a whole thing about poverty right now in the UK. And there's this little statement on the government website saying, we're still deciding whether income is a good measure of poverty. It's still an ongoing conversation. What is poverty and how do we best engage in it? And Tear Fund was really influenced by this thinking, and so we have become to define poverty much more in sociological and relational terms. And as Christians and as a Christian organisation, we believe that God, the Trinity, is in relationship, but that God created us as humanity to have 4 key relationships. Firstly, with God, but then with ourselves, and also with others in community and the wider world. And as we've already talked about, really I'm echoing things that have been said, we believe that God created the world good, that idea of shalom, where there was completeness, where those relationships were complete. And we believe that for every single human being to have fullness of life, there must be a restoration of those 4 relationships. And so our definition and our theology of poverty is that poverty is actually broken relationships. Broken relationship with God is a deep sense of spiritual poverty because we don't know who we are unless we know our Maker. When we have a broken relationship with ourselves, we can have low self-worth, comparison, isolation, loneliness, not living in that fullness. And we just see that littered in our own communities, the real disconnect there is with self and self-identity. When we have a broken relationship with others, we see loneliness, we see a disconnect, we see isolation, we see again that broken relationships with our communities. We see that everywhere we go in our own communities. When we have a broken relationship with the wider world, as Tear Fund, we're looking at this through a global lens. We know that most of the world's poverty comes from greed, exploitation, overusing resources, and they push people into poverty. And our vision and our belief at Tear Fund is God wants restoration of all of those relationships. That he wants fullness of life for every single human, that they're made in God's image and they find out who they are in God. I am a Christian myself and I love Jesus, and I love looking at how Jesus interacted with people. And when I've thought about it over the years and I've thought about Tear Fund's theology of broken relationships, I've begun to see it much more in the person of Jesus. Because when Jesus healed somebody, or when he cast out a demon, he was restoring, first of all, their relationship with God. Often these people were outcasts of the temple or the holy place. And Jesus went and he ministered to them and he reconnected them with their Maker. But also, when he healed the sick, when he cast out demons, he gave them dignity with themselves, whether it was physically, spiritually, emotionally. And when you start to read the scriptures, you see these little phrases like their sorrow turned to gladness. They had joy. Jesus gave them dignity with themselves. But he also removed the obstacles, whether it was sickness or demon possession. He removed the things that disconnected them from their community. And he enabled them to be able to engage with the world. And I love the story of the woman of the well, where we see all of those things, where Jesus connects with that woman. He gives her a restored sense of identity of who he says she is. And she runs straight back to the community that she's been outcast from. And she tells people about Jesus, one of the first evangelists. And so when we see Jesus connect with people, there's that real holistic sense of restoring those relationships. And one of the things that I've really observed over this is that this theology of poverty of broken relationships, but wanting to see renewal and restoration in all of those 4 relationships, it actually changes us and it gives us a mindset change. Because actually, we all have poverty in our lives and we all need restoration in our lives. And when we have a view of poverty being more economic or more material, we're in danger of having a separation where we start thinking of us and them, where we just do things for these people over here because these groups of society are poor. But when we understand that poverty is about broken relationships, we have to admit that we all have those in our life. There's all things that we struggle with. I'm a divorced single parent. It really resonates to me, this idea of poverty being about broken relationships. And I know I need God's healing and restoration in those areas for myself. And we've had a tendency, especially in the global West, to want to fix things, want to save people, want to rescue people, assume that we know stuff, assume that we can fix stuff. And often that comes out of such a good place of compassion and wanting to act, but we sometimes just need to slow it down and think, how do we outwork that in a way that holds the dignity of people, in a way that brings restoration in all of those relationships? To know that every individual has skills, often does have resources, and often does have a voice. How do we empower and enable that? Last week, there's one of them here, I just took 8 leaders to Uganda last week. And I took 8 church leaders from cities in the north of England to see some of Tearfun's work. And when I take leaders, often it's a learning trip. We're not going to do stuff, we're going to learn. We're going to learn about this approach to poverty. We're going to learn about community transformation. But what was really interesting is that as these leaders observed the work of Tearfund and they observed the transforming of lives and communities, is I observed them change. As they began to see communities with very little be so generous towards us that honestly it was almost embarrassing, the food they were bringing out for us, the generosity, the humility, the community-mindedness of looking after the vulnerable in their communities. As we saw that, and I began to witness these leaders change. And one of the leaders said to me, he said, I didn't expect to come on this trip and be confronted with my own poverty. And one of the things I find about this is that we begin to have a mindset change. It's really important that in the global north, we have that humility, that learning, that understanding that we're not experts in everything. But equally, a lot of Tearfund's work in the global south is really empowering people and so that they have a mindset change, that they don't think they're trapped in poverty and can never escape from it, but they're made in God's image and that they can engage with the resources they've got. So Tearfund's theology of broken relationships and wanting to see restoration informs our practice. And I just want to spend a little bit of time looking at that and also how we then measure how we're achieving success in that, okay? Because I think some of the tools that we use may be helpful for you in different contexts. So we use something which we call transforming communities. It used to be called Church and Community Transformation, but we're changing the name just to bring you up to speed. So we're calling this transforming communities. And the amazing thing about this piece is that it's really a change of mindset. It starts with Bible studies. It starts with, so we train local facilitators to run this process. Oh, it's almost a bit like the Alpha Course isn't a great analogy, but it's a process, it's a journey that's facilitated to create space for people to have a mindset change. And it starts off with the Bible. You know, Paul talks about being transformed by the renewing of our minds. And it starts off by facilitating this journey of going to people, you are made in God's image. God has given you resources in your community, and they go through a real journey of changing their minds and having their, you often hear the language, my eyes were opened, I was awakened. We actually call it awakening process of awakening individuals and communities. And then we start asking questions. What has God given you? What resources do you have as an individual or as a community? How can we start using the resources that God has given you to bless your community, to empower yourself? And this probably sounds like a little bit woolly, but what we see is exceptional community transformation. As I said, we've been working with 32,000 churches. The results are almost shocking and unbelievable in terms of individuals transformed. And one of the things when we're hearing stories of individuals, I'm always listening for, is there social change, spiritual change, and economic change? And when you start listening to the stories, you realize it's not just one change, it is that holistic transformation. So we're looking for people that were maybe isolated, but now they're knitted into community, that didn't have faith, that now have faith, that weren't able to provide for themselves, but through self-help groups and support have been able to have the dignity of providing for themselves and their own families. Marriages are often restored. We often see through this process, we often see people struggling with addictions, again, restored, and often not only become members of the community, but often become leaders or church leaders in their community. So we consistently, I would say consistently, see this transformation where we're working. There's a church in Rwanda. Could you just go back a couple of photos? Thank you. There's this guy here. I'm going to say Francois, so I'm not going to completely mess his name up. Some friends of mine about a year ago went to Rwanda. I wasn't actually on this trip, but they met this pastor. He, for years, had been leading a church of about 40 to 50 people in real poverty in his community, struggling for food, struggling for money. He couldn't take a wage from the church. And I think he heard about the process that we were running through other churches, and he decided, he'd tried everything else, so he had nothing really to lose. So he tried doing this process with his church. And what happened was, within the space of 2 years, the church grew to 1,450 people. Of those people, they'd come from a journey out of poverty. Many of them have been through self-help groups, have been able to start their own businesses. So then what happens is tithes start flowing into the church. The church grew in size in its community. Everybody in that church had enough money to pay for their own healthcare, which where we work is a big deal in the communities. They also had enough surplus in the church to pay for the healthcare of everybody outside their community that was vulnerable. And in the space of 2 years, he also planted 2 other churches, because some people were travelling too far, and they built a road because they were kind of disconnected from their community. So that's an amazing story. But I would say that every story that we hear has church growth, has individual lives transformed, but also has the church beginning to turn to its community and say, how do we work together to bring that transformation? That's his church. These are just off of our iPhones, so they're not very slick, but that's his church. And again, often you see part of the transformation is joy, is hope, just a complete change in people's spiritual demeanour. So I was in Uganda, as I said, only last week. And interestingly, we don't often do this, but we went to visit a community where we haven't yet started working, but we hope to start working really soon. We spoke a bit this morning about even darkness, and I would say that I have never been to a place so dark and hopeless in my life. There was no food because there'd been a drought. Jamie was with me, and you can talk to him afterwards about the trip and what impacted him. There'd been a lot of death in the community because of hunger, and we met a young girl whose parents, she was an orphan, she was raising 2 little siblings. We asked her if she'd had any food. She said she'd been eating leaves. The drought was ahead of them. They hadn't even got into the full drought yet. She said she was travelling 5 kilometres just for stagnant water, and there was open defecation because the toilets weren't running. It really was. There was such an air of darkness and hopelessness. And the partners we were there were so gracious and so kind, and they're looking to plant a church in that community so we can bring that transformation and change into that community. But then we went down the road and we visited another community where we'd been working for 8 months. This community, before we'd even got out the cars, was running down the road singing and dancing to meet us. They were dancing around our cars. They followed us all in as we travelled up the road. There was joy. There was transformation. They had completely cleaned up their environment. They were growing crops. The crops were growing. They had food. They were still struggling with some water shortage, but they'd made a well and they had some enough to be growing crops. And it was night and day difference in the transformation in a community where the 10 months of work that had been done was actually around Bible studies, transforming mindsets, empowering people, showing who God intended them to be, getting them to think about the resources that they already had in that community and how to really themselves empower them to engage with those. And then finally, we went to visit a community where we'd been working for 2 years. We met a guy called Pastor Daniel. This is Pastor Daniel. This thing he's showing, this is just again a picture of my phone, he's showing us his vision and plan for the future. At this point, he has already farmed a whole load of the land, got amazing crops, he's selling them at market, he's got like a whole little business going. All his children are in school, they're all in education, he's bringing this process into his community, but also with the surplus that he is creating, he's taking it into local prisons so that he is in turn a blessing to the most vulnerable. So we saw the real progression of what happens through, and I know it's like Tier Fund's process, but this process is fundamentally like kingdom discipleship discipleship, what you do when you ignite what the Bible is. It's not just about a heaven when we die. It's how do we bring the kingdom now and how do we become catalysts for change. I'm just going to throw out a few things in terms of how we measure this, because there's just some things that might be practically useful for you. Are you ready to go on to the next slide? This is something we call the light wheel. This is free. It's on a platform we've got called Tear Fund Learn. What it is, we've taken those 4 broken relationships, we've further divided them down. So it'd be things like living, social relationships, physical health. And we actually use this as a measure when we're working in communities of sort of mapping out how things are progressing or maybe where areas are needed. I can share these slides with you, but also this is a resource. But we use the light wheel as a measure for how effective our social and community transformation is being. And the other thing, just to throw out to you is, if you can go to the next slide, is we've also done a study recently. So again, based on our theology of broken relationships, then our methodology of transforming communities, but using this light wheel as a measure, we've just done an impact study. For years and years, I think Tear Fund knew that this was working. They knew it was transforming communities, but we didn't have the data. So now we've got some data, we're quite proud. We'll share that with you. So in 2022, I think we spoke to about 8,000 individuals across 5 different nations. We're beginning to roll that out in phases. So this is our impact study, and we've got some amazing statistics about the impact of this. If you flick onto the next one, and what we did is, I haven't got all of them here, but we measured communities we haven't worked with that haven't done the Transforming Communities programs compared to ones we've been working with. And we did it, again, holistic measures, not just like, do you have money? Yes, no. Just really like, how is your marriage? How's your faith in God? How's your community? And all of this. I've actually put some impact reports on every table, so you should be able to take these home. And I've also got some on the internet that you can have for free. So you will see a bit of a change in language. The one with the man on the front is our new language, Transforming Communities, but both of them talk about different packs of impact. I think we worked out that 9 out of 10 of the communities that we worked with had created or improved their own resources, like schools, roads, hospitals. This is like creating themselves. So it's a really high percentage of communities that are being like ignited to bring transformation. And the other one, if you just nip onto the next one, the other thing we measured, because we've got people in Tear Fund that love this, we measured the financial return of investment. So we worked out that if you invest £1, it unlocks £7 worth of local resources. And we've measured that to be £211 worth of holistic transformation in the community. So what we found is, isn't God great? That his idea of transforming minds and lives through the truth of the Word of God and the Bible, that we're made in his image, that we're loved, that we have purpose, that God's got calling on our life, that he wants to use us to bless our community. We've found that not only does this completely transform communities, it's also really sustainable and really economically viable. So I want to encourage you really out of everything that it's so important we have a theology of poverty and social transformation, because it also then gives us a measure of whether we're succeeding or we're not succeeding, and it helps us really build on that. So I want to encourage you to really dig in, not just to doing amazing social action, but thinking what is your theology, what are your values and principles that frame that as a measure. And we're here, so do come and chat to us, do look at the reports, I'll happily talk to you about that. We have Tear Fund Learn, which is a platform where we give away free resources, and we're doing the second phase of our impact study in January. We're actually getting data on growth of the church plants and spiritual transformation. That's coming out in January. If you want to have that, we'll take your names and we'll email you that as soon as we have that. The other thing I'd say is, that for people that are serious about learning about this, that for people that want to journey with us, invest in this, learn themselves, but also support the vision that we've got, we do take trips. They're not for everybody, but they are for people if they feel like actually there's something here that I really need to learn. If you think that might be you, if you lead a big church or you have an area of influence where you think this theology can help you, please come and talk to us and we'll see if we can squeeze you on a trip. Thank you.